Sorry about the technical difficulties. I hope this doesn't show up as multiple pieces when you go to my YouTube channel. But, anyways, welcome to Better Periods. This is the second week, so day two of the Better Periods live YouTube series. I am going to today talk a little bit about PMS and PMD and those kinds of things, as well as start getting into iron and hemoglobin. So, I had a question. Someone watched the replay of the first live on addressing PMS. Oh, and by the way, for anyone who jumps on, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will answer them as soon as I see them come through. So, first of all, when you have a period, because you're menstruating and because menstruation is connected to fertility and to the ability to procreate, it's also something that your body shuts off in times when it knows it doesn't have the resources or the conditions aren't correct. And that doesn't necessarily always mean, the way I see it, that you just, lose your period. Sometimes it can mean that just because you cycle doesn't mean your body's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing when you're cycling. So, for those of you who are maybe not super familiar with the female menstrual cycle, maybe I'll start by going there. So, you obviously have the first phase, which begins technically your cycle begins with the first day of your period. So, if you were charting, and I studied the Justice method when I was charting, but um, if you were charting, you would know that basically the first, let's say, half or the first couple weeks of your cycle is dominated by estrogen. And it's your pre ovulatory stage. And then you ovulate, and then you have what happens after ovulation, which is progesterone dominant. And when you So the beginning, typically your basal body temperature, I'm just going to briefly explain the charting because some of this is going to make sense. It's called your follicular phase. Essentially, your basal body temperature is going to be lower and you're going to see a spike in temperature because of the role of progesterone um when after you ovulate. And typically, like if you're charting, ovulation is confirmed by 3 consecutive basal body temperature chartings above baseline. And you usually need to be charting for a few months, like 3 minimum, in order to understand what your baseline actually is. So it's dominated by estrogen. And then you have a peak of estrogen and luteinizing hormone, which is ovulation. And then you have a domination of progesterone, which drops before you get your period. But because progesterone is your water loving hormone, think of this in terms of if you've ever been pregnant and you feel like you're all ballooned up and you're holding on to water, that's progesterone's job. Obviously, there's a good way to hold on to water and a bad way to hold on to water. But, anyways, progesterone is also the hormone that tends to obviously tank in our modern day environment in response to a loss of magnetism, non-native EMFs, because because your progesterone is so important for water and because your water is so important for you to actually store and process information from the sun, so light information, or to hold a charge, like sustain your energy by charging up a battery, so to speak. And also, when it comes to oxygen and magnetic molecule, so anything that responds to both natural and artificial magnetic fields is going to be really dependent on water. So, what tends to happen, and it's a really obvious one, is that the progesterone to estrogen ratio tends to tank. And that's a key sign that your environment sucks, meaning, either you're exposed to too many non native EMFs, you don't have enough sun for the repair that your body is trying to do, and all of this. And when you have PMS, it's hard to tell. PMS is a overall term, right? It's basically just a syndrome, and it's called premenstrual syndrome, which is the most non-specific thing you can think of. So, oh, by the way, anyone who's jumping on, just if you've got any questions, put them in the chat and I will answer them. Um, so PMS is a catch-all term. In order to find out what's actually happening, you probably want to chart. That's the easiest, cheapest way. Of course, you don't have to chart. You can just do a bunch of blood tests and you can run saliva, Dutch tests if you want, blood tests, go to your doctor. But if you're trying to do it yourself and you don't want to pay for a bunch of labs, then the most uh, charting is going to be the easiest, simplest, cheapest way to understand why you actually have PMS because it can be a few different reasons. For example, when it comes to severe migraines or serious symptoms of PMS, yes, you did. Welcome, welcome. When it comes to severe symptoms of PMS, sometimes it's not the actual progesterone amount, although we can't say this for sure because studies don't look at optimal levels. They look at you're still alive levels. It can actually have to do with the breakdown of hormones. So you've got this hormone pathway, which I don't have to get into if you don't want me to, but basically you got mom and data hormones, pregnenolone sits at the top, then under pregnenolone, you've got progesterone, DHEA, like androgens. Um, and then you have I'm totally messing this up. Pregnenolone, then you have progesterone, DHEA, androgens, and under DHEA, you have estrogen. And then you have metabolites of progesterone as well. And there's other names for them, and they do play an important role. But it's not just the amount of hormones that you make, which is why sometimes getting a hormone test is tricky. But then it's also how they then bind and travel and do the job that they're supposed to do in their body. So I subscribe to the belief that hormones are Maxwell demons, which means they're there to sort information in your body so your cells don't fall into a state of chaos. And chaos equals disease, order equals health. And so if they can't do that job, then even if you're making enough of them, that doesn't mean they're going to the right places, doesn't mean they're binding, it doesn't mean they're reducing chaos. Chaos. Like I've had clients like this before, who had perfect by optimal standards hormone levels, but still struggled with so many different things. So it wasn't the actual hormone she was making everything properly, it was what was happening after that. So it depends. Now, obviously, if you want to relieve PMS right away, then typically it depends on the person. Yeah. Yeah, it's a term in physics, like which basically means an organizer of energy. It's like imagine you have two buckets and it's organizing everything into one bucket and then the other bucket. And because your body relies on so much information, your body's so complicated. If all this information was just dumped and it wasn't organized, this has to do with this piece. This is what I'm supposed to do later on tonight. This is what I'm supposed to do right now. All of this has to be sorted and organized. And if it's not sorted, it, everything falls into chaos. I love the name. Anyways, um, for immediate relief for PMS, it gets tricky. And first, you have to determine how old you are and um, whether or not it's likely a progesterone issue. So for bad PMS, temporary relief, not a long term strategy, I have had clients who went over the counter and bought pregnenolone and it totally resolved their PMS. As long as they took the pregnenolone, like we're talking migraines disappearing, everything disappearing. Not a good long term strategy, really, because it's one of those things. It's a bioidentical hormone, and the more you take, the less you make. And you want to trigger your body's own production of it. But if you're really desperate and you don't want to take a painkiller, steroid, or what's those popular ones? They're Oh, it's a classic drug. I don't remember. That's often used in PMS, right? If you don't want to do that, then like that, if it was me and I was like, I need something, I'd probably do that. I wouldn't take overtaking a painkiller or anything like that. Awesome. And obviously, long term is going to be your biggest effective strategy. And I can't understate the importance of like resetting leptin sensitivity. We talked about this in week one. If you watched the replay, if not, you can go back and watch it because of the fact that it's going to be the master of all of these things that are happening. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is, and I have notes here in case you hear me shuffling, the whole anemia, blood, and hemoglobin, and all these things. So you have the quantity of red blood cells. I'm going to set some basics in here. And then you have hemoglobin, which is a heme based protein which carries oxygen. It's in your blood. And then you have these other things that are, I'm going to call them things. They're called porphyrins. They were relatively, I think it's a very recent discovery. I don't remember when. This year, last year, maybe I'm thinking too recent, but it was really, really recent. And they do a really cool job. So, first of all, if you know anything about deuterium, I'm not going to assume you do, but your blood is where you want the deuterium, and your mitochondria and your organs and your liver, whatever, is not where you want the deuterium. You want deuterium in your blood because when you sit out in the sun and the sun hits your skin and the ultraviolet A light hits your blood, the walls of where your blood is stored, it causes a squeezing effect and this makes light. It's kind of imitating a deuterium lamp. If you go on YouTube, I know we're on YouTube, you can Google deuterium lamp and you look at it, that's kind of what's happening in your blood vessels when the sun hits it, squeezes it, and it makes light. And your blood, so first of all, you have must have enough red blood cells to properly use light. It's soaking up the ultraviolet A light, and then in your blood, there's these little things. Let's call them minions named porphyrins. And the minions need to then take this light and turn it into a different kind of light that talks to your brain and tells your brain the hormones it's making, the status of your metabolism in terms of burning fat, the status of your energy in terms of your blood and reproductive organs, and your sex hormones. So if these minions are all of a sudden dying, then you're going to have a much bigger problem communicating with your brain. And this is what happens when you lose blood. So when you lose blood, you lose the quantity of red blood cells, and with it, you lose a ton of porphyrins. So if you suffer from sudden blood loss or you've suffered from chronic blood loss over a long period of time, then you can actually become electrohypersensitive. You can be much more sensitive whether you realize it to not or not to non-native EMFs or to a lack of a magnetic field. Why? Because the amount of red blood cells and porphyrins that you have, the sheer volume protected you from these onslaughts. And now that you've lost it, your protection is gone. By the way, welcome to anyone jumping on. If you've got any questions, pop them in there. Um, so what can you actually do about it? Because wait, before I go there, the hemoglobin part. So then you have the sheer quantity of your red blood cells. You have the little minions that are talking to your brain and using that light and turning it into another light. And then also you also have the oxygen carriers in your blood because you can't just have deoxygenated blood or you'd be dead. That's what happens when you breathe in carbon monoxide. It's called methemoglobin, and it needs to actually be able to transfer oxygen into your cells, your brains, your heart, whatever. It needs to actually take this oxygen and say, "Here's some oxygen. Oh, you want some? I'm going to give some to you. I'm going to give some to you." And there's two states of iron. One state is a state that promotes the right type of communication, and the second state is one that causes havoc. And this is why, I kind of mentioned in the last week about how taking iron is silly for a few reasons. And one of the other reasons I didn't mention, the reason why I'm not a fan of iron as a supplement at all, is because by the time you metabolize it, it's unlikely to end up in its proper state, the state where it can actually do its job and do everything. Why? Because the sheer act of you being anemic means your iron is probably not in the right state. You don't have enough iron in your blood that's in the right state, because the iron molecule's in the center. So, by definition, if you are anemic, you have heavy bleeding and hormone problems and have low energy, even if perhaps you're not truly anemic, maybe your ferritin's like a 30 and your hemoglobin's pretty good, and someone's like, oh, you should take iron, you're losing hair, blah, blah, blah. The fact that you feel that way means that that iron in the center of, there is not at the right state. So whether or not you feel differently when taking the iron, it's causing all these other after effects. Plus, if you're bleeding a lot, and this is about periods, it's kind of silly. It's like I said in last week, getting a drop of blood on one arm and bleeding out from the other. It doesn't make any sense. So, what you're going to do about it? So, the first thing is that now, because you have less red blood cells, you have to make more red blood cells. And ultraviolet light and infrared light are two hugely important wavelengths of light for making more red blood cells. There was an experiment done way back in the 60s, I think it was. It was in the book Ocular Perception of, oh, it's got some long ass title about eyes by, I'll link it later in the I'll link a PDF version of it in the comments after this gets posted. But anyways, they did a study where they bled out mice. They bled out half of their volume of blood, and they had two groups of mice. One was inside in the lab, the other group of mice was outside in outdoor cages. Basically, they bled out half their blood and then they just left them to see how long they would survive. So all of the mice inside died, and over half of the mice outside lived and were able to regain their blood volume much faster. It's crazy. I know, me too, but we live and learn. Um, and essentially, the difference is that one of them had the sunlight, and the other one were their fluorescent lights because was a really old lab. So, and I once had a client that found me when I used to work part-time at a health food store, and she came to me and she's like, "I something happened to me. I lost all this blood. I'm scheduled for an infusion and I've been feeling absolutely horrible. And the last 2 days were the first days that the sun came out, it was spring." And she's like, "You know what? And I said, I don't care. I went outside and I just lied down and napped outside all day. And now I actually feel better." And I'm like, "Yes, and this is why." And she's like, "Wait, really? I'm supposed to do that?" Um, but your ultraviolet infrared light is going to be really important to making more red blood cells and then everything else that happens because you have less of those minions that are communicating to the rest of your body to tell them what to do when it comes to your blood and your hormones and all that, and your leptin because they communicate to the leptin receptor. And then there's green light, which is really important for stabilizing red blood cells. So not only do you need to make them, but if you've ever had a blood test result where everything was super wonky, like you had sizes that were all over the place. I have notes on this. Where are they? And like your sizes were really different, the whatever. You need green light. So to make it like really simple, what is a way that you can get infrared light, ultraviolet, and green light under a tree? So, if you're actively trying to recover from anemia, even trying to, it's somewhere here, trying to spend, let's say, 1 hour, 2 hours every week that you can set aside in a really nice forest where there's tons of greenery and hopefully not too many people. So you can wear a bra top and the shortest, scantiest shorts you've ever, worn before in your life. And if you're not comfortable doing that, then wear longer clothes. And once you get into the forest, strip as many clothes as possible. That's important to the effect. So that would be a big tip. Now, let me see if I can find the rest of my notes. Now, the other thing is that because you store deuterium in your blood, and because you are meant to actually dump deuterium in your blood, you are meant to store deuterium in the blood, and then you're meant to dump it in your menstrual blood when you have your period. If you have an excess uh, development of deuterium in your body, especially in your pelvic area. So you have like let's call it a vacuum of space and water in your pelvis that is connected to this something behind your sternum called Meckel's cave. And behind there, you need the pressure of positive, negatively charged particles in the water to push up and into your brain. And when Dr. Cruz calls that the Z axis, and then the brain, remember that it's got the blood brain barrier, and you have this fluid in your brain that needs to be depleted in deuterium. And if you end up getting too much into your brain and it can't flow and it gets stuck, then you aren't able, that becomes broken. And then the second step after that is that your pelvic area or your hormones, as not your hormones, that is the wrong word, your reproductive organs as a woman, right, which are down there, are going to then collect deuterium next. So with deuterium and trying to deplete it, this is going to be the other thing that would be able to help you get less blood faster. Obviously, like my preferred way at the beginning for heavy bleeding, and I mentioned it in the first one, which is what I do with my clients, is at first I have a specific sequence of herbs that we take in high doses just to get it to stop. Because they do, yes, anything that's processed can have disadvantages and all that, but sometimes you just need to get it to stop as fast as possible. So if you wanted to make any engineers in here, oh, by the way, if anyone jumps in, has any questions, please just type them into the chat. Um, the ideal hack, if it was, the dead of winter and you were unable to get outside or whatever, and you're having a terrible time, would be infrared, green light, and ultraviolet light in a single panel. Nobody's ever done that before. Not that I know of. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But that would kind of be your go-to. And in the winter, if you live like in northern US or somewhere where there's like a serious winter, and if there's anybody who watches this from Australia and you get, 10, 15-degree weather and you tell me that's too cold, I'm going to make fun of you in a nice way, sort of. That is not cold. But I'm talking -20 Celsius, or what is that in Fahrenheit? I don't know, 40. No, 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 no. 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Fahrenheit. When you're in the low digits of Fahrenheit, where it's really, really hard to spend extended periods of time outside. And I want to actually clarify something that I mentioned in the week one. By the way, hello, and thank you everyone who's popping on. Just type any questions you have in the chat if you've got any. But I mentioned cold immersion as a really great way to improve your period while you're on your period and you have that heavy, painful sensation. Now, we're not talking freezing cold water like cold plunge style. We're talking like 55, 60-degree water, especially if you're not accustomed to it. Now, it is not the same as going out into the cold. So, for example, if it was winter and you were in northern US or in Canada and you step out and it's -20 degrees Celsius or I don't know, 5 degrees Fahrenheit. My conversion sucks, guys. Sorry. And you're out there and you're freezing. The act of the cold air pushing against your skin doesn't have the relaxing, relieving effect that a cold water immersion does. So it's important not to confuse the two because it gets confused so much where women are like, oh, cold on my period makes me feel worse. Yes, when it instigates the stress response. But if you do a cool bath in the sun, or if it's winter, for example, and you have a red light panel, you turn your red light panel on, right in infrared, right in, you know, the term, and you turn it on and you position it so that way it's hitting your body and you go into a cool bath, you're going to feel it. Like, trust me. And I was terrified to try it for like decades, but it really makes a awesome difference that you would not expect. But it's not the same as going outside in the freezing cold and getting that tense increase in pain that you may have gotten if you've had bad or painful periods and you live somewhere where it actually gets really cold. And then there is the depositing of oxygen. That's the last thing I'm going to talk about on this week's call by hemoglobin. So imagine you have a boat and the boat loads oxygen inside and it travels in your blood and it donates the oxygen to everybody who needs it. I'm hungry, I'm hungry. Okay, here's some oxygen. Now, the problem is that oxygen is called paramagnetic. Um, yes, literally, the left prescription is always the beginning of everything. It's not the end because then there's all these other layers, but it's always the beginning. And so you have the boat and it's carrying the oxygen in there. And the problem is that when your this response to the Earth's magnetic field is too bad. And then you can't sense it anymore because let's say you lost too much blood over the course of too much time. So you don't have enough hemoglobin in the first place. So you got a problem there. And then maybe maybe you have higher exposure to EMFs. So if you live, you know, in the US and Canada and almost everywhere around the world where we have a massive increase in towers, like here now, I can't drive 500 yards without seeing 1 to 2 towers. They're extremely dense, and then they've changed the law so they can add tower structures on other things. So anyways, the point is that the reason why that matters to this conversation right now is because non-native EMFs reduce your sense of the natural magnetic field and they screw with how that oxygen is interacting. And because of how they interact with calcium channels, they actually upregulate your pain and everything is more painful. So, when this happens and the natural magnetic field and the natural magnetic field being made in your body has reduced, how does that make sense? Well, if you look it up and you Google vortis in the heart, like there's scientific literature that it's not a debated thing. Vortis in your blood vessels, it's there. If you do like whatever, there's these they spin. Everything that spins has a magnetic field. And also, you have your ATP synthase, right, in your mitochondria that spins and that creates its own magnetic field, but it spins against water. So, if that water becomes too dense and the spinning slows down, then you have an overall reduction in magnetic field, not just because of the EMFs, not just because of maybe Wi Fi or your friend's phone or whatever, or the Earth's declining magnetic field, anyways, but also because now you're not spinning as fast and this makes these boats, instead of being drop off points, entry and drop off points for oxygen, they're prisons. And this little boat runner guy says, all the oxygen, get in. And then he locks the doors and they can't get out anymore. Not 100%, obviously, or you'd be dead, but to a certain extent, that's what's happening. So, how do you force the boat cage to unlock? Well, One of the ways to do this is by drinking carbonated water. And that's why this has been such a big talk of discussion lately, because the act of consuming carbonated water forces the gates of the locked doors of this now prison boat holding your oxygen in your blood to open, so that way more oxygen can be then donated to the necessary guys in your body, and now you feel better and you feel less anemic, and it's reflected in your blood test eventually, but that is a takes a while. It's not a fast process. um I hope that that wasn't too bad of an explanation and it made sense. Thank you to everyone who joined me, and to those of you who are watching the replay of this live. The last Better Periods live series is going to be next Monday at 5 p.m. EST, June 22nd. And if you can't come, just pop any questions you have in the comments of this video, and I will address them in the next one. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday. I don't actually think that's him. I highly, highly doubt it. There is so many people copying him, and I don't know if you remember, but he said that if you ever see anything that's not Dr. Jack Cruz, like at Dr. Jack Cruz, and it's followed by anything else, it's not him. He said that before because he gets impersonated perpetually. So I actually saw that account and I was going to report it because, yeah. Anyways, um, thank you everyone again. And I hopefully will see you next week. Have a great Monday.